Will Hurd, a Republican member of the House Intel Committee, that will conduct those public hearings this week. Congressman Hurd, the top Republican on House Intel, Devin Nunes, says that he would like to call the whistleblower, the unnamed whistleblower, to testify in public in these hearings. And here's what President Trump has to say about the whistleblower.
The whistleblower is a disgrace to our country, a disgrace. And the whistleblower, because of that, should be revealed.
Now, the whistleblower reportedly works for the CIA, where you worked for almost a decade. Should his identity be revealed? Should he be called to testify in public?
I think we should be protecting the identity of the whistleblower. I've said that from the very beginning, because how we treat this whistleblower will impact whistleblowers in the future. Having this whistleblower law on the books is important. It's an important checks and balance, not only in the Intelligence Committee, but our government. But what I would like to see happen is for Adam Schiff, Chairman Schiff, Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, to answer questions about what was his engagement with the whistleblower before the information, the whistleblower's allegations were transmitted to Congress. He has misled the American public earlier in the year on what he knew about or the contact that he had with the whistleblower. So if you want to protect the identity of the whistleblower, I think it's important for Chairman Schiff to answer questions about his interaction with him.
What do you think about, as the Republicans are seeking, calling Hunter Biden, the vice president, former vice president's son, as a witness?
I would love to hear from Hunter Biden. I would love to hear from the other Americans that served on the board of Burisma. I'm curious to know how someone who doesn't have any experience in Ukraine nor experience in a natural gas company becomes on the board of a natural gas company in Ukraine. This is, we also need to hear and understand the corruption. We know corruption in Ukraine is an issue. Ambassador Taylor has said that in his testimony. Dr. Hill has said that in her testimony. This is something that was concerned even in this current new administration in Ukraine. So hearing from people that can help provide insights into that, since that is central to this conversation, would be valuable.
Now, Congressman Schiff responded last night to the GOP witness list that had been offered by Chairman Nunes, and here's what Schiff said. The Intel Committee will not be used, quote, to carry out the same sham investigations into the Bidens and 2016 that the president wanted Ukraine to conduct. Given that response, Congressman Hurd, what does that say about the fairness of the process that the Democrats are running in holding these hearings?
Unfortunately, Chris, this has been a partisan exercise from the very beginning. When one piece of information comes, people that don't like the president say, this is an example for impeachment. People that support the president say this is evidence of exoneration. I think we should just turn over every rock and pursue every lead to ultimately get to the truth. And it's unfortunate that the Democrats on the committee and the Democrats in the House have created this partisan exercise. In a normal hearing, the minority, the folks that are not in power, have the ability to offer a witness. We can't do that in this case. Under previous impeachment inquiries, the minority and the president has had the opportunity to call witnesses, be involved. The majority of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and Chairman Schiff has prevented some of the lawyers for the administration to come in and be there with the folks that were testifying. That's not a fair process. If we're interested in trying to uncover the truth, then let's not put our thumb on the scales. But unfortunately, that's what this process has been. And what's even crazier is they're trying to have this completed by the end of the year. And I think we only have 16 or 17 legislative days left in the year. Half of those days are what's called fly-in, fly-out days, where people are coming in from their locations. So to try to get that, try to pass NAFTA, to fund the government, to try to do all that in that short period of time, I think that's next to impossible.
You talk about the extreme partisanship, maybe on both sides, Republicans and Democrats in the House. You are not. While you're a supporter of the president, you're not a party line supporter. You oppose some of his policies, for instance, constructing the border wall. You oppose and have spoken out against some of his language during his time in office. For you, What specifically do you want to learn from these hearings?
So I think talk about impeachment has been premature. I think impeachment is one of the most important and consequential things a member of Congress can do, and I think there's 535 different opinions on what impeachment is. To evaluate that question, I think it's a violation of the law, and so I want to see, does this establish a criminal intent? And yes, for me, I agree when I agree, I disagree when I disagree. And having spent 9.5 years as an undercover officer in the CIA, I was the guy in the back alleys collecting intelligence. I also did this through embassies. I know how embassies work. And the fact that Ukrainians, officials, weren't contacting their U.S. counterparts until August 29th, when they read in, I believe it was a Political article about aid being withheld. That was the first time that any Ukrainian had contacted a State Department or government official about this. That was more than a month after the July 25th phone call between the president and President Zelensky. So what do I want to see?
Go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, you go ahead.
No, what I want to see is there an ability to establish criminal intent? Did the Ukrainians know that this was some kind of quid pro quo? When you look at our relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine over the last 3 years, there's been more aid going to Ukraine this year under this administration than the previous administration. Ukraine's an important partner.
Let me ask you specifically, though, about this, because there seem to be two issues that were part of the quid pro quo. One was military aid. One was a meeting that the Ukrainians very much wanted between their President Zelensky and President Trump. All three of the witnesses that are going to testify this week, you see them up there, William Taylor, George Kent, Marie Ivanovich, all career Foreign Service officers, say there was a clear connection between support for Ukraine of various forms, U.S. support for Ukraine, and Ukraine investigating the Democrats. If you are satisfied that that is true, that there was this connection, this nexus, is that an impeachable offense?
Well, I don't know if it was necessarily investigate the Democrats, right? I think it was investigation of corruption. And so people have made assumptions.
Forgive me, sir, but specifically what President Trump said on that July 25th phone call was investigate the Democratic role in the 2016 election, whether they were involved in hacking the DNC server, and also specifically the Bidens and Burisma.
Well, on the 2016 elections, now some of that information was based on what has been kind of fringe thinking, but back when even Democrats started investigating the Russian involvement in our 2016 elections, there was a Ukraine nexus. And so trying to get to the bottom of that, is that a violation of the law? Now, was that an understanding based on debunked information? Yes, but is it a violation of the law? I don't think so.
But specifically, sir, the question is, if there was a quid pro quo, U.S. aid for Ukraine was going to depend on their doing these investigations of political rivals of the president. Is that an impeachable offense?
I think if you're trying to get information on a political rival to use in a political campaign is not something a president or any official should be doing. I think most Republicans have said that would be a violation of the law.
So that, in your view, if that were established to your satisfaction, I repeat, that would be an impeachable offense.
I believe that's something that would make it have to truly consider whether impeachment is the right tool or not.
And we will see what happens this week and whether or not it persuades you. Congressman Hurd, thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Good to talk with you, sir.
Thank you, Chris.